Andrew, nice to have you here with us. Thanks for taking the trip. Last time we met, we were in Munich, wasn't it?
That's
in September.
Yeah. I can just about remember.
That was when you released NovaLager yeast.
That's right, yeah. We released it for Drink Tech, which is a big trade show in Munich.
Naturally enough, we had some beers over...
over the course of the week, there was quite a lot of beers that we drank,
The best beer I had was actually a cold IPA. It was refreshing, very hoppy, tropical, yet very clean and crisp. I loved that beer. That was the best beer I had on the whole conference. When I came back, I started digging around this recipe and this beer style, and also spoke to you about it. You suggested to use the NovaLager, and that turned out to be amazing. It was a really, really good beer. Lots of tropic elements to it, crispy finish, and just fantastic hop character. Easy drinking. So you can just have one. You have to have several. So yeah, but I was thinking now we are proud to release our 4th beer kit with Lallemand. So it's very exciting, and you can find it in our web shop, Olbrygging.no. It will also be like a special offer until Sunday. So yeah, just go on the webpage and try this fantastic cold IPA. Now I want to give the word to you, Andrew. So you can tell us a little bit more about NovaLager and the other yeast types you have.
Cool, sounds good. Well, I'll go through NovaLager first, and my Norwegian is absent, so apologies in advance. It's all going to be in English. But I'll give you the story of how we came to produce NovaLager and why we did it. And actually, it's almost a happy accident that it's good for cold IPAs, because when we were first coming up with this strain, it wasn't really something that we thought about. These days, a lot of our strains are being created in collaboration with a company called Renaissance Biosciences, which is based in Vancouver. And those guys are experts in breeding yeast. So what they do is they take yeast and they put them in like pretty nasty conditions and force them to create spores, which are kind of like eggs for yeast, right? And then if you fuse those spores together, you can create a new strain. So NovaLager is actually really unique in that it's a type 3 lager yeast, which sounds really technical and boring. But we're going to kind of nail down and tell you what that actually is and why it's kind of interesting. So one of the nice things about being able to breed yeast is that you can have objectives, right? If I go out into the environment and look for yeast, then I'm going to just find a yeast that's already existing and it works in the way that it does just because that's how it's evolved. But if we're going to create a strain, then we can actually have a list of objectives that we want to hit. And we can aim to hit those when we create the strain. So these are kind of what we were looking for with the NovaLager. And the reason that we were looking for these things is because we've noticed, actually first in the homebrew world, and then now kind of following on in the commercial world, is that lager is really big. Probably about 2 or 3 years ago, we saw these conversations going on about pressurized fermentation and lager yeast in homebrewing. And that's now kind of followed on to being big in the commercial brewing world as well. So that was kind of the idea behind producing NovaLager. And there's a lot of little breweries out there, right, that aren't very well set up to create a traditional lager. So they might not have the ability to control their fermentation temperature, and they almost certainly don't have hundreds of really big conditioning tanks that they can leave the yeast in or the beer in for like 2 months, 3 months. So we wanted something that could kind of mitigate all those issues and still produce really good lager. So this is our list of things that we want. So a really wide range of temperatures that you could use. So traditionally lagers fermented between 9 and 14 degrees. It's great, but it's quite slow. So we wanted to speed that up by allowing it to ferment at different temperatures. We also didn't want it to produce any sulfur. So one of the things you get with lagers, it's quite common for this to be a little bit there, but you get quite a lot of H2S production, which is the rotten egg flavour. And you have to wait for that to disappear. It's very volatile, so it leaves eventually on its own. But if you don't produce it at all, then you can produce that lager much quicker. We also wanted it to have low diacetyl production abilities. So again, when you're producing lager, one of the reasons you leave it for so long is because you need to leave the yeast time to reduce down the diacetyl that's been created during fermentation. That's kind of a buttery flavour, and it's generally not desired except in very special circumstances. So Pilsner Urquell, for instance, it's meant to have a little bit, but most of your lagers are not. So we wanted to have a yeast that will produce less of that. At the same time, we don't want it to be like everything else, so we want it to be quite unique.
Is it a crossed strain? Is it crossed with any others?
It is, yeah. We'll come on to that.
Okay.
So, this is where I'm going to talk about type 2 and 3 lager yeast. So, lagers have got quite an interesting genetic history. I'll try and be very quick about it, but they've evolved from a hybridization event, so two yeasts coming together to form a new species. And one of those is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the ale strain that you use for brewing fermentation all of the time. And the other is a wild yeast called Saccharomyces eubayanus, which nobody had ever heard of until about 2011, which is when it was discovered living in the wild in South America. And nobody really knew how that hybridization event happened. But the wild strain is quite often associated with oak trees, so it's quite likely that it happened in a brewery environment in a fermenter that was made of wood, and that strain happened to be there. So that initial event created this new strain, Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is lager yeast, which I'll call it that from now on to make it easier. So lager yeast has two distinct types, right? Type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the original Carlsberg yeast. Nobody uses it for anything. Commercially, it doesn't really exist out there, right? All the yeast you'll buy on the market for lager production are type 2 lager yeasts. They are characteristically lager yeasts. They create sulfur, create diacetyl, they ferment slowly at cold temperatures. And in modern times, with modern biotechnology, we start to look at whether we can improve that and whether we can do something better. So what we've done here is we've created a type 3 lager yeast. So what we've done is we've taken this lager strain here, which contains some of the wild genetic material, which is in green, and some of the ale yeast genetic material, which is in white. And then we've forced it to form spores or eggs, and we've forced those spores to mate again with an ale strain. So this is the ale strain on the top left here, this American one. And at the same time, we've incorporated into that strain a technology that means it can't produce H2S, so it can't produce the rotten egg flavour. And in forcing those two spores to mate together, you create a new lager strain, which we're calling Group 3, which is essentially a lager strain that contains a slightly greater proportion of ale genetic material than a wild lager yeast would, right? So it comes with advantages of having slightly more ale genome in there than lager yeast genome. So that strain there on the left is NovaLager, right? So we're going to talk a bit about the lab trials and what we've done with it. So on the right hand side here, you can see the temperature tolerance. Now, different yeast strains like to grow at different temperatures, right? And one of the ways that you can differentiate an ale strain versus a lager strain is the maximum temperature of growth, so how hot it can survive at. So this is just a test that's been done at 37 degrees, and you can see Diamond 3470 don't grow at all at 37 degrees. Belle Saison loves it, absolutely loves it. And then these are two genetic hybrids that have been created by Renaissance, one of which is NovaLager and one is a related strain. And they all grow quite nicely at 37 degrees, which just indicates the level of temperature tolerance. On the left-hand side, you can see this graph here that shows how they ferment at different temperatures. So we've done 15, which is probably around where most people are using this strain, and then 20 and 25. And you can see even at even at 15, your fermentation is still done by around this point here. And if you're going up at 25, it's done within like 2 to 3 days. One of the things I had mentioned before when we were talking is that actually you can use it at quite high temperatures without that much in the way of downsides. So the flavours that it produces, even when you start to get really hot, don't really change that much. We'd still probably recommend going on the lower side, so like 15 to 20. But if it does get up to 25, it's unlikely to give you those kind of really hot flavours that you would get in a normal ale fermentation. The idea of this really is just to show you that it does still taste like lager. So some people might expect that because you've got more of that ale genetic material there, you wouldn't have so much of that lager character. And this is just some sensory panel data that we've put together to show that that isn't the case. You're still getting that proper lager flavour from it, and at the same time, you don't have any of this sulphur down here, which is what you want to avoid in your final products. Like it's normal for it to be produced doing a lager fermentation, but if it's still there at the end, then it can be unpleasant. So this strain doesn't produce it at all. This shows the fermentation speed as well versus a regular type 2 lager yeast. So this is your type 2 in orange here. And you can see even after 300 hours, it's still not done fermenting, whereas the NovaLager is done around here. And I've got some commercial data from breweries more recently that shows that it ferments in about half the time. And they've been really happy with that in the brewery because it means they can up their throughput. You know, they're an ale brewery, but they're producing a lot of lager now, and they can't give it a 2-month tank time. So if they can use a yeast that drops that fermentation time, then it gives them a real advantage. This is a fun experiment where we tried to force the strain to produce H2S. So that's the egg flavour. One of the reasons that flavour is produced is due to nutrient deficiencies in wort. So sometimes if you've got an ale strain that's kicking out a lot, it might be because there's not enough nitrogen there. So what we've done here is we've created a fermentation condition that's deliberately stressful. So it doesn't have enough nitrogen in that fermentation. So you'd expect it to kick out lots and lots of this flavour. And what you see here is that even in that specialist condition where we've tried to force it to create that sulphur note, it still can't. And that's just because that pathway doesn't exist in the strain. So it's not even that it's producing less, it just is not capable of producing it at all. So you've got absolutely none. It is actually in green, but it's directly behind these blue ones, so it mirrors the line perfectly. Appreciate it's not represented particularly well. This is one looking at diacetyl production. So on the left-hand side, you have uptake of valine, which is an amino acid which exists in wort, and diacetyl is produced in the production of valine. So if your strain is better at taking valine in from the surrounding environment, it will produce less diacetyl in the first place. So on the right-hand side, butane there is a fancy name for diacetyl. You can see the peak of diacetyl during fermentation is much, much lower. So your standard type 2 lager yeast is coming up here to probably about 2,700 parts per billion. With the NovaLager, it's just over 1,000, which means that diacetyl will be mopped up much more quickly at the end of fermentation. So you get less of that flavour, and you can take it out of the tank much quicker.
It's quite a robust yeast type.
So
it's quite a robust yeast type. It can take a lot of pain.
Oh yeah, it can take a lot of pressure. That's what you want, really. I mean, one of the reasons, so Nottingham is one of our strains that's been the most successful over the years. One of the reasons is because it's really bulletproof. You know, you can knock it down to 12 by accident and it will still come back, and it can ferment into the 20s, and it doesn't give you too many off flavours. So I think a strain that's truly flexible in the brew environment is quite important.
Does it perform best under pressure, or it doesn't matter?
It doesn't really matter. So pressure is something that's been spoken about a lot over the last probably 2 years, I think. And it depends how much pressure is the true answer. So if you have a degree of pressure but not too much, what you'll find is it makes your strain more neutral. And that's because it slows yeast growth. So you get less ester production and less of that flavour. But if you go too high, it slows the yeast growth to the point that it stops fermenting at the right rate, and you get stunted or incomplete fermentations. So, you know, if you're going to ferment under pressure, just don't be putting it under like 2 or 3 bar, because it's going to be inhibitory rather than beneficial. But a little bit of pressure is always nice. Yeah. It's, you know, in a commercial brewery, it's good practice to have a little bit of pressure under it, because it means that nothing can get into the tank, because there's always a positive pressure of things getting out. That doesn't work if you get to a really big brewery, because the tanks are so tall that if you pressurize them, it's dangerous. A little bit of pressure is always quite good. Just don't go too much. And this is the kind of profile we get from it. So, as you said before, it's very, very clean and very, very crisp, and it's noticeable that sulfur note isn't there. Because even if that sulfur note's there in a tiny amount, you still get a sort of strange kind of sulfur, not that almost like a lack of cleanliness type flavour to it, and that doesn't exist for this strain at all. At the same time, one thing that we do see is kind of an apple type flavour. So kind of not like an acetaldehyde like green apple, which would be a fault, but kind of like a light kind of red apple type note, which is more noticeable sometimes than others. I'm not entirely sure why. There's a lager brewery in London that's been using it, and they get it, and they ferment it at about, I think about 17. And then there's a brewery that I spoke to recently in Birmingham who use it at a similar temperature, and they don't get it. So we're not sure where that's coming from, but it's quite a nice flavour, to be honest with you. It's certainly something that I'd quite welcome in my lagers. So this is kind of the vital statistics of the strain. So group 3 lager yeast. The attenuation range is pretty standard for a fully attenuating yeast. So you probably see some strains down into the mid-60s, but mid to high 70s is pretty normal for most lager yeasts. Our recommended temperature range is 10 to 20. What you would have to probably vary a little bit is the pitch rate if you went really cold. So if you're going in at 10, we might recommend that you use a slightly higher pitch rate than if you're going in at 15. But one of the reasons that this strain has become quite popular is the pitch rate is actually lower than a standard lager yeast. And the reason for that is because it dries better and it grows faster in our propagation systems because it's got more of that ale yeast genome in it. Still has quite a high alcohol tolerance, so if you wanted to do a 13% cold IPA, you could. Not sure I'd recommend it. And, you know, at that alcohol content, you're going to have to use a high pitch rate as well. We also have looked at its biotransformation abilities. So I don't know if you guys know much about biotransformation abilities, but it's basically the tendency of yeast to release bound hop flavors from hops. So you can end up with an increase in hoppy flavors. This one we think has got quite a high level of beta-glucosidase activity, which releases flavors like linalool, which is like a classically hoppy character. There's 2 types of biotransformation, but I won't really go into that. But we think it's quite good for that as well. So all in all, it's been quite successful, and you know it was originally designed as a lager yeast, but it works really, really well for cold IPA. And I think this year, if it's not the year of lager, it's going to be the year of cold IPA. So I think it's going to be a really successful strain for us.
Yeah, lager is really in the wind.
It's massive.
American lagers, hybrids, and
I've seen, I think, at least in the market in which I work most of the time, we had before COVID, we had a lot of breweries that didn't do core ranges, so that every beer that they did was a special. But during COVID, they sort of needed to build a bit more brand loyalty, and they needed to make the same beer more than once so that people would keep coming back because they weren't at the pubs. You know, they weren't able to try something new on the tap wall every time. And I think that has really led that shift towards lager, IPA, pale ale.
Have you heard about any that has been co-fermenting with the yeast?
What, down at 10?
Yeah, I mean the NovaLager and another yeast.
Certainly the NovaLager, yeah, absolutely, yeah. There's been people going down to 10, 11 degrees with it, and it works like slower than it would do at 15 or 16. Yeah. But it's still a very successful fermentation. I think somebody did maybe a Baltic Porter with it at that sort of temperature, which is a nice style.
Yeah.
So next I'll talk about our Farmhouse strain, which is something we released, I think it was maybe a year ago now, we did the Farmhouse. And again, that's a strain that we've developed with Renaissance, and again, it's a strain that's designed to target a specific problem within breweries, and that problem is diastaticus. So we'll talk a bit about that, because it's a huge subject. Diastatic is basically a yeast that can ferment a greater proportion of the wort sugars than a normal yeast would, and therefore continues fermenting further than an ale strain or a lager strain would, which is great if you're trying to produce a really dry saison, and not quite so great if you get it in your pale ale and then you put it in a can, because they all go pop. So we were basically looking at a solution for that particular problem. This is what wort looks like, right? So wort is basically a sugar solution. You've got lots of different types of sugar in it. Glucose, maltose, and maltotriose. All of these are fermented by yeast quite happily, so they use them all up. And then at the end of fermentation, you have these things called dextrins that are left over. And that's, you know, if you've got a beer that finishes at like 10, 20 gravity points 2.5 Plato. That's what's left. It's those dextrins. And they are long chain sugars. And SDA positive or diastaticus yeasts can eat those, right? So you'll think at the end of fermentation that your ferment is completely finished and it's not doing anything, and you're going to put it in a bottle and you're going to put the lid on and it's going to be absolutely fine. With these beers, what you see is a continued gravity drop. So this is a comparison of a diastaticus strain in orange versus a standard strain in blue, and you can see it keeps ticking down. And while it continues ticking down, it's creating carbon dioxide, which means it's pressurizing the container. And then eventually the container gives up. So if it's a can, it'll probably go at the seam and it'll split and it'll start leaking. If it's a bottle, if you're lucky, it'll go at the crown. But if you're unlucky, you might break the bottle, which is a problem for breweries, right? Problems related to lawsuits, that sort of thing. So what we really want is a saison strain that doesn't do that. You still want the flavour from the saison because it's a nice flavour, but you want to limit the potential for accidents in your brewery, particularly now that everybody's got their own canning line. So you want to keep that out of your canning line. So this is a strain that we created with that in mind, and it's an SDA negative, so a diastaticus negative saison strain, which also doesn't produce sulphur. And that was a bit more complicated to produce because one of the first things we needed to do was include this sulphur reducing characteristic within a strain. But that strain also needed to have efficient utilization of brewery sugars. Because quite often these strains, these saison strains, they don't ferment maltotriose, which is the 3 glucose unit sugar. That one. They don't ferment that particularly well unless they're SDA positive, so that unless they're diastatic. So if you knock out that characteristic, sometimes they just don't ferment very well at all. So you need to find a strain that ferments well, even without that characteristic. So that was the first stage, was to create this strain here with a very exciting name of BBY571, which can't produce sulphur and also is able to utilize maltotriose quite effectively without the SDA characteristic. So that was the first stage in the breeding program. They then had to breed that with a natural saison strain. So you take in the flavour production abilities of that saison, but at the same time you remove the ability to ferment those longer chain sugars. So it's quite a long process. You know, you've basically got 3 lines, three crosses, and each one of those crosses will probably produce between 25 and 50 different strains, all of which then need to be tested. So it's quite a lot of work in the laboratory to create something new. So this here parental lineage probably represents, like, I don't know, 50 different strains, of which we eventually chose this one. And this is how it works. So it's quite different to our Bell Saison. I don't know if anybody's tried our Bell Saison strain.
Oh, yes.
But it's quite a peppery strain, and it's quite aggressive during the fermentation. This one's probably got a slightly more tropical kind of note to it, so more of a classic Belgian style Saison. Westphalian is the kind of flavour I get from it. So it's slightly different, and we kind of did that deliberately because we wanted it to be unique and slightly different from our regular Saison strain. But this is what we get from the sensory panel. So quite a lot of tropical fruit, and then that pepper flavour as well. And that does vary according to temperature. So on the right hand side here, you can see that banana tropical fruit characteristic will increase going up towards 27 degrees, which is about where you want to ferment a Saison strain. And at the same time, this clove characteristic drops. That actually is interesting because clove shouldn't drop, right? It shouldn't drop at all because it's malt derived, that flavour, so it should be fairly constant. But actually it's a masking effect, so as you ferment higher and you get more of those tropical fruit and banana flavours, you actually end up basically being able to taste the clove flavour less. So it's still there, it's just you can't taste it as much. You'll see it attenuates to 82, which is about what you'd expect for a regular ale strain. A Saison strain, you're probably talking somewhere in the region of 90-95% attenuation, so much higher. If you wanted to achieve that effect, because some still want that dryness in the product, you would probably look to use enzymes within the mashing process or mash for longer at a low temperature, and then you get that attenuation up. So yes, this strain won't attenuate to the same degree as the Saison yeast, but if you wanted it to, you could find a way around it, right? And then you'd have the flavour that you wanted and the attenuation that you wanted. It doesn't flocculate particularly well, which is fairly standard with yeasts like that. And it has a very wide temperature range, so you can use it between 20 and 30. I'd probably recommend going on the high side because I like my Saisons to have quite a bit of flavour to them. But if you go on the low side, you can make something that's almost reminiscent of a lager, and I've done that in the past where I've produced like a 4.5% Saison lager thing, which is really nice to drink in the summer. So next I'm going to go through the story behind Verdant. So this is a different strain, right? This is not produced with Renaissance. There's no breeding that happens here. This is purely a story of how we work with breweries that we get on well with in the business. So Verdant are some guys that are based down in Cornwall. This is the head brewer here, James. That was their old brew house. So you can see they started on fairly rudimentary equipment, just kind of single skin vessels with wooden tops. And you'll see that they've changed somewhat to that. So really nice, shiny brewery. They've actually got, I think they've got 2 mash tuns. Not sure they need to, but they've got 2. And we have a really good relationship with them, right? So we do quite a lot of work with them. They're based down in Cornwall, which is the far southwest of the UK. I live in the west of the UK, and it still takes me 4 hours to drive there, so that's how far away they are. The roads kind of just stop. But it's a very nice place, a nice fishing town on the south coast, and they've got a really nice fish restaurant there as well. So we've worked with them a lot in the past on the Verdant, but we've also worked with them on the NovaLager. So we've done a cold IPA with them, and this is when I was there on Brew Day, doing the cold IPA with them. Anyway, going back, I think it must be 5 years ago now, they approached us and wondered if we might be able to do something with their house yeast that they were using for their fermentations. And we said, well, we'll look at it. We'll see if we can isolate a strain from it. And we isolated 3 yeasts from their house culture, one of which was to become Verdant, which we now sell. But it's quite hard to come up with a strain like that where you never know it's going to work. So when you dry yeast, not all yeast like to be dried very much. So there's actually quite a high chance that even though we isolated one of their yeasts, it wouldn't actually want to perform in our factories. We got lucky here. It actually grows really, really well, and it dries really, really well. So it's been a success for us. It's got quite a unique kind of character. Very kind of mango-y, plum kind of flavours to it, quite citrusy, but it also seems to do something with the mouthfeel. So I don't know if anybody's had a Verdant beer here, but they tend to be quite full in the mouth. And part of that is probably the water treatment they use and the malts that they use in their grist. But the yeast probably has an impact on that as well. We're not entirely sure of the mechanism, but Verdant seems to create this really nice kind of mouthfeel to it. That's what their beers look like if anybody's not had one there. Kind of very hazy, very craft. Tastes great. So when we've taken this yeast in, we then have to characterize it, and this is all work that we've done in our own labs. So when we work with Renaissance, we do some work in their labs and we do some work in our labs. This is all done in-house. Lallemand has labs at the National Research Council of Canada in Montreal. We've got a beer lab there, and we've got 4 or 5 guys in R&D, and then lots of students that help them. And they'll do a whole series of kind of different fermentations, looking at the properties of the yeast in different conditions, and they'll come up with something that looks like this. It's like the Bible of the strain, and each of the strains has that particular Bible. And what I've done is I've taken that Bible and I've distilled it to 4 bullet points. So probably be unpopular with somebody because that's a lot of work that they did. But it ferments really nice and quickly. 5 days at 20 degrees. I'd probably play around with that. If you want to go cleaner at 17 degrees, it works well there. But I like it between 22 and 23. It has a medium to high attenuation, and it does seem to have a lower affinity for maltotriose than some strains would do. So, strains like Nottingham will probably just zip to 82% really easily. This is probably going to be more like a 75, I think, most of the time, depending on the mash temperature you use. So if you go in at a higher mash temperature, you'll find that this one it doesn't ferment quite as far. And if you've got a lower mash temperature, it'll probably do the full range of attenuation. It does flocculate reasonably well, although that does seem to be quite variable. So one of the most common queries I get from breweries is this strain isn't flocculating like I want it to, which isn't necessarily this strain. It happens with all the different strains, and it doesn't seem to have any pattern to it. So, people that are trying to make really hazy beers quite often assume that yeast is the main driver behind haze, and that isn't necessarily the case. If you look down a microscope at a German wheat beer, for instance, you won't see any yeast. All that comes from protein from the wheat, and it's quite often the case with a big hazy IPA as well. But yeast does seem to have a role, particularly when you combine that with dry hopping. So yeast and dry hops together seems to make a greater haze than maybe yeast would on its own. It's quite complicated and nobody's quite sure of the mechanisms behind it yet, but it's being thoroughly researched at the moment. And then, optimal temperatures, as I said, between 18 and 23 degrees. I actually think this is one of our most flexible strains.
Is this crossed with the Belgian strain?
No, this is it's probably historically an Old English strain.
Okay.
So there's quite a lot of yeasts out there that have kind of English regional brewery heritage. Probably in the 50s to the 70s, there was a great deal of consolidation in our ale brewing market. So you went from having probably every town had a reasonably medium to large sized brewery to there being like 2 very, very large breweries. And a lot of that yeast diversity was lost along the way. But a lot of these strains that are coming out now are probably from that sort of original line of regional breweries in England.
I heard you shouldn't ferment this under pressure. Is that the case?
No, you can.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on what you're aiming for. One of the reasons that I really like the Verdant is because it's quite flavour active. But if you're going to ferment at high pressure, it's going to produce way less flavour. So it's you might be losing something there. But at the same time, pressure can be useful if you can't control your fermentation temperature and you're going to be fermenting warmer. A bit of pressure will help prevent that much of the aroma production. It doesn't produce as much alcohol as some. So our Nottingham can go up to 14, and I think I've pushed it to 15.5 before. This will only do 10, and then it gets a bit grumpy. Doesn't produce any of that phenolic flavour which you get with Belgian strains. So again, no Belgian lineage there. You don't really need to know about killer properties. I don't know why that's on the slide. Some strains will produce effectively competing factors to kill off other strains, particularly wine strains do this. So they'll basically create a protein that kills other yeasts around it. And some strains are more sensitive to that than others. So Verdant doesn't like it. Don't try wine yeast at the same time. And then pitching rate, 100 grams a hectolitre for the strong beers, 50 grams a hectolitre for the standard strength beers. So just as an example of fermentation, the kind of time you would expect it to take. So a standard 12 Plato beer, 48 gravity, will be done between 2 and 3 days quite easily. I already spoke about that a bit. This is the attenuation again. It's just that the maltotriose, it doesn't love it as much as it likes some sugars. So if there's more of that maltotriose there, you probably see a slightly lower level of attenuation than you would see with maybe a Nottingham or a BRY 97 type strain. And you can influence that with your mashing technique again. So change that mashing temperature, change the grist. You can up it if you want a greater attenuation, lower it if you want, other way around. Up it if you want up it if you want a lower attenuation, lower it if you want a higher attenuation. This is the results of our sensory panel. So you get these really nice kind of tropical flavours, apricot and peach. But the one thing I like to note quite often about Verdant is you quite often get this vanilla characteristic that people talk about, which is a weird one because it isn't something you would normally expect from yeast, but it does exist in fermentations using Verdant. And that actually makes it quite good for dark beers as well. So it's one of our more flexible strains. You can use it for these big, thick, juicy IPAs, and it makes a really nice beer. But I actually really like it in a stout as well. So Unity Brewing, who were in Southampton, they did some really nice stouts with it. And it was really fantastic. And when you do that, that vanilla character seems to really shine through. I've just ended. I'm going to go back a slide so it doesn't go. So that's the three strains I was going to talk about today, the Verdant, the Farmhouse and the NovaLager. But if anybody has any questions, I'd love to hear them. So I think we've got some online probably coming through. But if anybody in the room has any questions, shoot. I'll try my best to answer.
I just wondered what's important to think about if you're doing a co-fermentation. Is it important to like pitch the one yeast strain before the other, or can you do it simultaneously, or?
Kind of depends what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And it depends on the strains that you're using. So let's say you were using a Windsor strain. Windsor doesn't ferment multi-trios, so its attenuation is lower than other strains. But if you wanted that attenuation to be high, you could pitch another strain at the same time. But the Windsor's quite flavour active, right? So if you want to get the most from that strain, from a flavour perspective, you might want to leave pitching that other strain until a bit later. So you might pitch that Windsor first, and then towards the end of the fermentation, when you want to finish it and dry it out, then you can pitch something else. Then there's other strains that you probably wouldn't want to pitch together. So for instance, our Philly sour strain, it creates lactic acid, but it creates lactic acid from glucose. Glucose is about 15% of the sugars in a brewery fermentation. So if you were to pitch two strains at the same time, they'd compete for that sugar because that's the one they like to eat first. And therefore you'd see less in the way of sourness using that strain if you were to do that. So if you wanted to use two strains, you'd have to pitch the Philly sour first and then pitch another one later on. So it's always worth kind of thinking about what each strain will bring, and then how you could influence it to do the fermentation as you work. Any other questions?
I did have one question come in beforehand of the
let's go with that one.
webinar. It's about reusing yeast, and is there any like data on how it affects every time you reuse? It's probably different between strains.
Yeah, it is, and it depends on how you store it, how quickly you do it. I mean, they're very, very simple. It's a case of emptying your fermenter, removing all the beer, and then collecting the slurry. It depends on kind of where you get the slurry from. So if you're using a conical, you'd probably want to ditch the stuff that comes out first because that tends to be dead or old, and then you want to take the stuff above that, but you'd want to stop before you get to the stuff that's really young and mutated and weird. So it is quite complex, and then you probably want to use it within a week, I'd say. Best practice, you can get away with a lot, but the best practice would be to use it within a week. And if you're taking it from very strong fermentations, I probably wouldn't bother because it's quite stressful for the yeast, so it won't like it very much. One thing you do have to consider, especially on the home side, is that if you're going to repitch a strain, yeast requires oxygen or air to create sterols, which it needs for its cell wall to be able to survive through another fermentation process. So if you aren't able to oxygenate or aerate that wort for the second generation, it's not really worth doing, because what you'll see is that the fermentation will end early. You probably see it stop 5 to 10 points above where it should. And you'll end up with a stuck fermentation. You'll have to pitch new yeast in anyway. So you would need to oxygenate or aerate. If you're using oxygen, you can use it straight. If you're using compressed air, it needs to be sterile filtered, which, on the home scale, that's adding extra complexity. In a commercial brewery, you'd likely have that stuff in-house anyway. It's a process that you ought to control. That being said, you can get away with a lot of kind of not quite so good practices. I remember when I was at university, the brewing professor I used to use yeast that was like a month old. He'd just add more of it, and the fact that half the cells were dead wouldn't matter because he'd added 200% too much. It's not how I'd advise making beer, but it can be done.
How many generations can you reuse these?
It depends kind of on the yeast strain and the fermentation environment that you're working with. So you'll have heard of old breweries that go indefinitely, right? They've never changed their yeast. And they tend to work with open top fermenters, and they take the yeast from the top. And that's very unstressful for the yeast. If you're using a conical tank, especially in a big brewery, it's got a lot of pressure on it from above, and that pressure will eventually start to cause the yeast to deteriorate and mutate. And you'll probably get between 6 and 10 generations out of a commercial strain like that. But then there's breweries that say they've never changed their yeast, which is bad for business.
Yeah, if you do the top harvesting, you can use it.
You can. Yeah, there's a few, and they'll tend to. You don't see it very often, but they have like a suction lance or like a spade, and they'll suck the yeast off the top. It's quite cool to see. But you will find in those breweries that it drifts, right? So, they might have used the same strain for 50 years, but it won't be the same strain that they started with. It will have changed slowly over time. And an open top system isn't the most hygienic, so you'll probably end up having to clean the yeast every now and then. So there's a process called acid washing, which you will probably never do on a home scale, but commercial breweries will take that yeast and they'll drop the pH to 2, and that will kill off bacteria, but the yeast can survive it. So you drop your pH to 2, let it sit for a bit, and the yeast will be okay, but not very happy. The bacteria will die, and then you'll pitch it into the fermentation, and that sort of clears it up for the next fermentation. Bad practice to do it a lot. Probably better off refreshing your strain and starting again, but it's, if you're indefinitely using your yeast, you will have to do that at some stage.
There was one question related to it from Torfinn. He asks if you have any comments on dropping new wort directly onto yeast with harder oxygenation. He comments on. He calls it Chainsmoking. I'm not familiar with that expression.
Chainsmoking is very bad for you.
So the question is actually, do you have any comments on Chainsmoking? But that's kind of
don't do it. No, if you oxygenate your wort, it will probably work. You won't have much control of the pitching rate, obviously, because you're just dumping it on top. And you won't have much control on the health of that yeast because the whole population is there, the dead ones and the mutated ones. But it certainly can be done, I wouldn't recommend doing it too much, but it can be done. Any other ones? Any questions from the room?
There is one more from Frode. He asks, when you're repitching your yeasts, do you have to take into account a higher attenuation? He says he has experienced that with White Labs 2 English Ale.
So there could be two things going on there. One is if you have an initial pitch that isn't the healthiest, you might find that the attenuation isn't as good as it could be. And therefore, on the second generation, when you've got a greater population of yeast there, you will have a better fermentation and higher attenuation. The other option is that he's got a diastaticus infection, and it's increasing the attenuation that way. I would probably suggest in this case it sounds like it would be the former, so it's probably a fact that the initial pitch, the health of the viability wasn't as good as the second yeast. That would be my suspicion.
Yeah, because it's not supposed to evolve into better attenuation.
No.
There's another cause.
Yeah, so it won't evolve into better attenuation, but it might be conditioned to be better at fermenting. Yeah.
So I can ask a question.
Go for it.
It's not only, of course, you are into yeast.
Yes.
But you're traveling a lot around.
Yes. Yeah.
And you meet commercial brewers, you meet the homebrew scene all over Europe. So what is the trends that you see regarding beer?
The biggest trends, beer styles wise, it is lager. Definitely, yeah. So I mean, we've done a lot of work over the last few years as to what we should be targeting strains at, because obviously you want your strains to be successful, and you need solutions for the styles that people want to brew. And all the work that we've done in it suggests that IPA isn't going away. So it might mutate. There might be new styles that come up around it. For instance, like cold IPA, but that's going to be a trend that's here to stay. And at the moment, cold IPA seems quite big, and then the West Coast style seems to be kind of in vogue a little bit as well. And then lager is absolutely huge, and that's something that I expect to be the case for the next couple of years at least. Over the last probably 5 years, we've seen how craft brewing is. You get these sort of trends that come in waves, and then they go. I think IPA is always here to stay. Lager's probably here to stay, and then there's the niche ones that come along might be less kind of lower staying power. So I think the Kveik beers, we've seen them really drop off. They were really massive for about 2 years, and that craze seems to have died down a little. We've got lots of those strains within our collection. We've released one, but at the moment, I'm not sure that there's the market to release another. So they've dropped off. But lager and IPA will definitely be here to stay.
I feel like the monster stouts, I mean, the really big, the high alcohol stouts are on their way up, and been for a while. But from a home brew perspective, it's quite difficult to create it without the alcohol taste being too dominant, I feel.
I think you're right. I have seen there's definitely been like a slow trend towards that. I don't think it's ever going to be massive business because there's a limit to the number of 12% stouts you can drink in an evening. You know, for some people anyway. But yeah, it is hard to do it at the homebrew scale without getting that hot character, you know, the kind of like boozy sort of character to it. I think probably one of the best ways you could maybe avoid that would be to ferment cold in the winter and use a very high pitch rate, and then make sure it comes off the yeast quickly. So you get those boozy flavors from a hot fermentation that's going too fast. So if you can cold it down, then you can control that to a degree. But also because you get very stressed yeast in a nasty environment, they sink to the bottom and they die faster in that sort of fermentation environment than they would in another. And then you get that sort of savoury. I think do you get Marmite in Norway? No, it's like it's a spread that you put on toast and bread. Vegemite, that's like the Australian version, but it's made of dead yeast and salt. So they make it in the same place in the UK as they make lager in Cors and Burton-on-Trent. And what they do is they take the yeast and they boil it with salt until it turns black, and then they spread it on toast. Sounds great. Anyway, that's the flavour that you get in imperial stouts that have been allowed to ferment on the dead yeast for too long. So if you can get that off quickly, maybe rack it a couple times into clean tanks and leave that behind, then you won't get that flavour. And next time I'm here, I'll bring Marmite. Their tagline is either you love it or you hate it, and yeah, I hate it, but some people like it.
One question here asks about your opinion about rehydration on yeast.
Okay, yeah, that's a question we get a lot, and we have since I joined the company. So the quick answer is you probably don't need to. The long answer is that the rehydration process was originally developed probably like 20, 30 years ago. And when it was developed specifically for wine yeast, not for brewing yeast. And when people started making dry brewing yeast, they automatically just used that procedure because they were like, this is what you need to do to create yeast for a wine fermentation. In reality, the differences between wort for brewing fermentation and a wine must from grapes is that they're completely different. Wine juice is like basically just fructose with some trace elements and not much else. Brewer's wort has lots of complex sugars, it has proteins, it has vitamins, it has minerals. So really what you've got in a brewer's wort is a quite nice rehydration environment. So if you dump yeast into a brewer's wort, it doesn't immediately scream and die. It usually quite likes it. So in a brewery wort, you don't really need to rehydrate. And what we find is if you do a side-by fermentation with one that's rehydrated and one that's not, it doesn't really make any statistical difference at all. So it's something that we've recommended in the past, but now we sort of don't really recommend that you do it that much. There's one caveat, and that's if you're creating something that's really sour or really strong. That's not quite such a nice environment for the yeast, so then there might be some advantage to doing it. But for the most part, you don't really need to.
So how did you end up in Lallemand?
Oh, yeah. I've got a biochemistry background, so I studied biochemistry, and they sort of push you towards pharmaceuticals or finance and insurance because you can do numbers, which isn't very exciting. And I didn't really want to do that, so I looked at master's courses in Edinburgh, which is where I lived at the time, and there was one in brewing and distilling, which I quite fancied. Actually, I wanted to look at distilling, but the thing is, if you if you work in distilling, you basically have to live in a really remote part of Scotland, right? And all my family lives in the south of England, so it's, you know, quite a long way from family and friends. So after completing the degree in brewing, I decided to go work in breweries, not distilleries. And the first brewery I decided to work at actually was in a remote town in Scotland called Brewdog, which is on the northeast coast of Scotland. Actually in the town at the time called Fraserburgh, which is a fishing port with not much going on. And I was there for a year, but my wife lived in the south of England and wasn't very keen on that arrangement. So I was there for about a year, and then I moved to Darkstar, which was one of the first wave of UK craft breweries. I think they started in '94. And I was there for 6 years before starting at Lallemand in 2018. January 2018, I started at Lallemand. And I've been there ever since, first covering the UK market and now covering the UK and Ireland and the Nordics as well. So yeah, I get to get out of the house a bit, which is nice. Go to all the cold places. I think one day they'll give me somewhere warm. Yeah, that's how I got into it. I quite enjoy it though, it's fun. Getting out about and speaking to like-minded people, and you know, we support home brewers just as much as we do commercial brewers. You know, quite often commercial brewers are home brewers originally, right? So they've started their brewery up with a home brewing background. So it's good to kind of socialise and work in both markets. I was actually in Helsinki 3 weeks ago doing the BJCP judging exam, which was fun. So I can now judge BJCP competitions, which is nice. They had 2 horrible beers. They gave me a Belgian triple that they'd put 20% vinegar in, and then there was something else they topped up with apple juice, and you were drinking it like there's something wrong with it. I don't know what's wrong with it, but there's something wrong with it. It turned out it was apple juice. So, yeah, that's how I got into Lallemand. It's fun. It's fun business to work in, and you know that you're exposed to so many interesting people because we don't just work in brewing. So we meet winemakers and distillers and people that make cheese and people that make fuel ethanol. No, not quite so interesting, but yeah, there's lots of cool industries that we work in.
There's come in a few questions here, actually. One is kind of obvious, as a welcome to Norway question. It's obviously about Kveik. You were actually the first company to make a dry version of Kveik commercial.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure there is another dried one actually.
There has been a few after, especially the Voss strain has been made by quite a few companies now, but I believe you were the first one.
I think so, yeah.
And that revolutionized the way we could distribute Kveik.
Believe it or not, the way we came across that didn't even involve Norway. It was quite strange. So my colleague Robert, who's based in the UK, was at I think he was at a homebrew competition somewhere like Slovenia or somewhere, and somebody handed him this beer and said, I made this and I fermented it at 37, and he said, "Don't be stupid." Nobody does that. And then it turned out that he'd used this Kveik strain. So Robert got in touch with various people around Norway and collected, I think, like 30 different cultures, one of which was the Voss strain that we eventually launched. But yeah, the initial kind of seed for that idea, we didn't really know anything about them. So it was a homebrew thing in Central Europe that sparks our interest.
Are you thinking to lancate more Kveik strains?
So we do have several, and we've thought about it. The issue we have is that actually the fermentations that we do with them, they actually don't tend to come out that different. So the Hornendal one, which we've got, actually comes out quite similar to the Voss. And is there any need to launch something that essentially does the same job as the one that we've got already? Not sure that there is. So at this stage, probably not. If there's like a wide kind of resurgence of interest, then we might look at it, but not at this moment in time.
Have you looked into any Mead yeast?
So Mead is something I actually get. Mead's something that Lallemand doesn't really know what to do with at the moment, right? So we've got. Lallemand used to be called fermented beverages, and we used to lump together wine and distilling and brewing, and now we don't. So we've got a wine division, we've got a distilling division, and a brewing division, which means nobody really knows who owns Mead. And in reality, most meads are made with wine yeast, because it's a simple sugar. So you would tend to use like an EC 1118. It's probably the basic strain that you would look at, which is one of our wine division strains. And then beyond that, you might look at some other interesting strains, but they're all mostly from the wine catalogue. So usually I say to my colleague Sigrid, who's based in Denmark, who knows a lot about mead, can you help this person with mead, please? And she'll talk to them.
What about the cider? Have you done some work with that?
Again, ciders, you'd actually class it as an apple wine because of the medium. The sugars are very different, right? So it's all fructose, which is wine yeast business, effectively. You can use brewing yeast for it, and they do work well. They might lend something to the fermentation that a wine strain might not, but classically and historically, there'd be wine strains. And even in like a wild fermentation, you'd probably test the yeast and find that it's more similar to a wine strain than it would be to a brewing strain. I actually make my own cider, and I use the ICVD 47, which is a Lallemand strain, which is quite nice. And then occasionally I get really high acid apples, so I use another one which reduces the acidity during fermentation, and the name of which will come to me. I forget at the moment, but it will come to me. Yeah, it's quite clever. The main acid in cider fermentations is malic acid, and it will convert it actually into alcohol, so it reduces the acidity in your final product. So, useful.
How do you recommend adding the yeast to the water, spray it on top?
I would sprinkle it on top, yeah. Sprinkle it on top.
That is the best way to do
Yeah.
it. Don't
Yeah.
stir it in. Don't mess with it.
The problem with rehydration is quite often you just end up making a mess. That's what I find anyway. So you sort of, it foams up and then you spill it, or yeah. Whereas if you just sprinkle it on top, then it's never going to be a problem.
It's actually that easy.
I used to try and rehydrate kind of 6 kilos at once, and it'd be everywhere. It was a nightmare. It's one of those things. I think the practicalities of a commercial brewery means if you're using more than a brick, rehydration becomes a total pain.
Question for me. We talked with you a bit earlier here, and tell us a little bit about Lallemand. It's actually a huge company. How many employees?
So I think it's around 5,000 now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are different divisions.
Different divisions, yeah. So it's kind of set up as almost like separate businesses, right? So we have company-wide meetings where you'll meet people from different divisions, but for the most part, we're separate. So I work with the brewing team, which is probably less than 100. But then the really big divisions are distilling and biofuels. So in South America, they do a lot of production of ethanol for cars. So they don't use petroleum, they'll use bioethanol. And that's really big business. And then baking's huge. So we have quite a lot of baking factories around the world. Distilling. I think we've got, must be business in every continent, I would think. Because we've got businesses in South Africa and Asia, Australia. So yeah, we're pretty global these days. So.
Huge Christmas parties then.
Yeah. No, the brewing team's only small, so we tend to have one kind of company meeting a year. In the past, we've done it in Vienna, which is where our yeast factory is. So you can go and see the yeast factory at the same time, and actually it's a really good place to visit because I don't know if anyone's been to Vienna, but the big lager there is Otterkringer, and it's on the same site as our yeast factory. So if you go to the yeast factory, you can go next door to this giant lager brewery and drink it fresh from the conditioning tanks. And rumour has it there was once a pipe that went into the yeast factory and you could draw it off yourself, but I don't really believe that. And it also has a microbrew attached to it. So on the top floor they have, it's actually a tank. So yeast is grown on molasses, and this is an old molasses tank that they've chopped the sides out and turned into a building. And on the top floor you have brewing, and on the middle floor you have fermentation, and on the bottom floor you have a bar. So if you ever go to Vienna, go to the Otterkring Lager Brewery and go to the little microbrewery next to it, and that's right where our yeast factory is. Nice place to visit. We also produce little bits in other plants around the world. So we've got the Saison yeast is produced in Germany because you want to keep the diastatic yeast away from your regular yeast. So that's produced in Passau in Germany, and then we do bits and pieces at Felixstowe in the UK, which is not such a pretty factory. It's kind of in the docks. Ships come in and unload the molasses, and then they make yeast. Mostly for the distilleries, actually. So it mostly goes up to Scotland. But the one in Vienna is pretty worth going to.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for coming up to us.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't
been,
too boring.
Informative. Really good.
And obviously, if you get any questions since or after the talk,
We will.
Yeah,
We
shoot
will.
them to me and I can
Definitely.
help out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.